Robert Jervis passed away on December 9th at the age of 81. He was one of the major figures of international relations scholarship in the history of the field of the study of international relations. In October 2015, Robert Jervis sat down with me for a long interview about his life and career. He discussed how his upbringing shaped his worldview from a young age, and I kid you not, in the interview, he traces the origin of his most famous work, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, to an event when he was 6 years old. Robert Jervis was incredibly generous with his time. It was a long and thoughtful conversation about both his personal history and the origins of some of the big ideas that he brought into this world. This episode was behind a paywall. I've been doing this podcast since 2013, and the first couple hundred episodes are these kinds of long-form interviews with people who have led interesting lives and careers in foreign policy. Those are now available only to premium subscribers, but I've brought this out from behind the paywall on patreon.com/globaldispatches today because, well, I know that his work impacted the lives of many people who congregate around this podcast. It was a great interview. Here is the late Robert Jervis from 2015. My guest today, Robert Jervis, is on every international relations syllabus. He's probably best known for his book Perception and Misperception in International Politics, which was a groundbreaking work that applied principles of cognitive psychology to international relations. And he tells me he can trace the origin of that book to a specific moment of his childhood.
Literally, when I was, 6 or 7, I remember asking my parents what the U.S. should do in response to, it was either the Soviets, probably the Yugoslavs, shooting down American planes in the Adriatic. How do you respond in these situations? And when will a forceful response, when will that induce better behavior on the other? When will it reduce the level of conflict by making it clear to the other side that belligerents will be met with counter-belligerents?
In addition to Perception and Misperception, we discuss at length the origins of Jervis's first book, The Logic of Images in International Relations, which is also part of the IR theory canon. Jervis also discusses the influence of his family, growing up in New York in a highly political environment, how the Vietnam War reduced his own hawkish inclinations, and he discusses some recently declassified work he's done with the CIA to help them figure out why they got some big questions wrong. But we kick off talking about time travel because, well, you'll see. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. As always, you can hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg or send me an email via globaldispatchespodcast.com if you have suggestions of people I should interview or topics I should cover. And do check out globaldispatchespodcast.com. We have a very robust archive of conversations like the one you're about to hear with foreign policy thought leaders and luminaries. And now here is my conversation with Robert Jervis. Okay, so I was trying to think of how to start this interview, and there's this totally ridiculous item that was just published like moments ago on the Twitter feed of the New York Times Magazine. And I wanted to ask you about it and see if it has any, broader applications to international relations theory. Okay, so here it is. And forgive me, I think this is totally idiotic, but it's the talk of Twitter right now. So the New York Times Magazine asked its readers if they could go back in time and murder baby Hitler, would they do it? 30% said no, 28% said not sure, 42% said yes. How do you stand on this question?
I mean, I would register yes. The objections, of course, are of two types. One is purely moral, that killing is simply immoral and we shouldn't do it as a country or we shouldn't do it as individuals. IR theory doesn't have much to say about that. Some of my colleagues, like Mike Doyle, who work on normative as well as empirical questions, might, but I think we go with our gut instincts. If we're not going to kill Hitler, we're not going to kill anyone. A reasonable position, but not one I take. The more interesting objection is, be careful what you wish for. That is, do we really know what would happen if Hitler hadn't been born. Uh, Usually that line of argument goes, something worse could have happened. And here I think the rebuttal to that reply is really pretty devastating. That is, even for the most imaginative of us, it's hard to think of much worse than World War II, with not only the Holocaust but the international dimensions and what it led to. But it does raise the point that counterfactual history, first, is very difficult, and it is legitimate because it both taps into the retrospective analyses of policies, and it also taps into our views about causal relations in the world.
But wouldn't on this specific question of killing baby Hitler, I mean, wouldn't traditional IR theory reject the idea that any individual has just tremendous sway over the order of the world or whether or not countries go to war?
Yeah, very good point. I mean, there are a lot of traditional IR theories, and the ones that are largely outside in purely structural and situational would reject that, and a lot reject the argument that killing Hitler matters. And also a lot of the trends in the general intellectual environment in political science, history, other fields in the last 30, even 40 years run against the so-called great man theory. But this is first, I think those trends have gone much too far. I think individuals do matter. And to give an advertisement, I had an article in Security Studies.
Great journal.
Yeah, about 2 years ago on when and why leaders matter and how we would know. And I think they often do matter, even in less extreme cases. Here, even a structuralist, might argue that Hitler is just so important and so unusual that it really would matter. Structuralists would argue, and I would tend to agree, that no matter what happened, Germany was going to be revisionist after World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles really crippled its privileges but not its power. When Germany regained its power, it would seek to regain a larger place in the world. I think that's true. And this would lead to conflict. That's true. Doesn't mean it would lead to World War II or the enormous mass murders. So I think this is a hard case for a pure structuralist.
So while we're on the subject of time travel, I'll take this question a little bit further. So you're famous for, among other things, analyzing the implications of what's called spiral theory, or sometimes the security dilemma, which is basically this idea that states take actions to maximize their own security, but in so doing might, for unforeseen reasons, cause or create the outbreak of war because other states see those actions, which the state A believes to be defensive, as offensive and somehow aggressive. How might time travel affect spiral theory in this case, and what implications might that have?
Well, I don't think it affects the theory. It certainly affects the applications. If we went back to the mid-1930s, and we see, I believe this is debatable, but I believe we see many of the decision makers in Britain, especially Neville Chamberlain, but a great many others, believing the spiral theory. That is partly growing out of their interpretation of 1914, believing that conflict with Germany is avoidable and that a hard line, or what we now call a containment policy, would be more likely to increase disagreements and disputes and conflict with Germany, and that this was unnecessary, and that therefore a policy of appeasement should be followed. And as you may know, and some listeners will know, in the 1930s, the term appeasement was a favorable term. It was entirely non-pejorative. It referred to making a situation more peaceful, conciliating. Well, in retrospect, I think we'd say, hey, right theory, wrong application. It just does not describe Hitler or the Nazi regime. And if you were following the wrong theory, you're likely to get the wrong prescription. And in fact, you had to do something much more belligerent than that. So when you know, in a way, now that we know the answer,
Mm-hmm.
because there's still disputes about Hitler and about Chamberlain, but if you know the answer, you can then go back and do a lot better when you take the test.
So we'll kind of move away from theoretical time travel and talk about your own history, your own background. As I mentioned, you're someone on every IR theory syllabus. So I'd love to learn a little bit more. So I would imagine a lot of my audience probably know you or at least familiar with some of your theories, but I'd love to kind of trace where you're from and how you became to be the IR theorist that everyone knows. So where are you from?
Yeah, well, let me go back to the security dilemma. And you know, that's drawn from chapter 3 of Perception Misperception, where I contrast the spiral model versus deterrence. And that question of what will be the possible effects of a hard line, threats of force, even use of force, when are they necessary and when will they make things worse? That's both a question that continues to preoccupy me. I look at American policy toward Russia, both Ukraine and Syria, and ask that question. And it's the question way I started with. I mean, literally when I was, 6 or 7, I remember asking my parents what the U.S. should do in response to either the Soviets, probably the Yugoslavs, shooting down American planes in the Adriatic. Of course, they claimed those planes were on spy missions, and being a self-righteous and loyal American 7 or 8 year old, I thought we would never be spying on other countries that way. Of course, they were spy planes. But that question of how do you respond in these situations, and when will a forceful response, when will that induce better behavior on the other? When will it reduce the level of conflict by making it clear to the other side that belligerence will be met with counter belligerence? And
so what did your parents say?
As I remember,
they said, there, Bob.
Yeah, well, they were very political, so they were willing to indulge this, but they didn't have the answer.
What sort of business were they in? And where in the country were you born?
Yes, and this does matter for the background. I was born in 1950 in New York City, where I lived until I went to college and then moved back when I was age 40. Anyway, New York then as now is a very political city. My parents were not engaged in politics professionally. My mother was a homemaker and a very skilled potter, uh, and my father was a lawyer, but they were both typical liberal New York Jews, a religious Jews. But it matters because that whole milieu of the New York culturally but not religiously Jewish community was very politically aware, very focused on both domestic and international politics.
Did their parents settle in like the Lower East Side or in Brooklyn, like via Ellis Island?
No, they were there longer than that. So we were, I'm happy to say, on the Upper East Side.
Okay. By then you had made the trek uptown.
Yes.
Okay. So that's pretty impressive. That's sort of atypical of many, I think, Jews of your generation, right? That it wasn't your parents, but maybe your grandparents or even
right.
great-grandparents.
It was my grandparents,
Okay.
especially my grandfather, who was a major New York builder. But it was, a hothouse political environment. A lot of my parents' friends, again, were not in politics in the formal sense, but everyone would be talking about what was in the newspapers. And, the question of the emerging Cold War, and of course, domestically, the rise of McCarthyism Now, these were very, these were very close to the bone for what I was interested in. I mean, what all my parents' friends were, and the high school, the grade school and then high school I went, this was a subject of constant conversations. So this was, I was a product of that environment.
And so how did you start pursuing these ideas, this environment, sort of intellectually? Like what outlets do you have early on when you went to university or even in high school?
Well, in high school, there was, and even before, this was just what we would talk about. And it was fifth or sixth grade. About five of us put out, was in a mimeographed newspaper. This predates Xerox, let alone electronic media. A current events newsletter. And I remember we were discussing the purge trials in Eastern Europe. Oops, I should know the year. What, 48, 49, 49, 50? And one of my friends was drawing the cartoons for the Slansky trial, and I was writing up the analysis. And this was in grade school, this was not considered unusual, something that marked you out as more nerdish than anyone else.
Everyone was writing manifestos back in the early 1960s anyway, right?
Well, this was the 50s. Everyone in the schools, a private school, the ethical culture schools.
Oh, yeah, that's a well-known one.
And this is what this and the baseball season, this is what everyone was interested in. So you didn't have to be at all abnormal to absorb a lot of this. And
did any of your friends from that area, from grade school, go on to become kind of well-known public intellectuals?
No, they all, I think, kept up political interests, but I was the only one to go on getting a PhD in political science. A lot of that was when I went to college, which was Oberlin College, which was very much like the ethical culture schools. That is, left liberal, more socialists than Republicans, very much attuned domestically to first McCarthyism, then the civil rights movement, civil issues of civil liberties, and of course the issues of the Cold War. And I was in my freshman, sophomore year, very interested in the missile gap, and then I was much more of a hawk. And there was a 3-part story in the New York Times about the missile gap with a lot of information. And I sort of wrote up a paper on my own about it. And those interests partly built on themselves.
So you had a hawkish take on the missile gap.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I did change, but my political interest didn't change. But partly in writing perception and misperception, and partly because of Vietnam, and partly because of my general reading in history, I became much more dovish. When I started perception and misperception, and particularly the chapter 3, I started out as a defender of deterrence theory. I still believe deterrence theory quite often is appropriate. I don't believe in any way it is totally misplaced. But as both things got, as the Vietnam heated up, which I thought was a mistake, and as I read more of historical cases, I became convinced that states often did overreact, often did perceive a good deal more hostility from others than was there, and did often, not always, but often overlook possibilities for conciliation. So I moved to be much more amenable to dovish spiral model analysis of situations, but I do think each situation is different.
That's interesting. Are there other IR theorists or IR intellectuals who had that kind of similar shift as you? I mean, that went from kind of being a little more hawkish and a little more, cold warriors to having the experience of Vietnam fundamentally change how they think the world is ordered?
Well, I think Vietnam is extraordinarily important. I'm going to teach it the next 2 weeks in my undergraduate seminar. It was important to me, but not seminal, because I already was deeply interested in politics. And in fact, in the spring of '63, for Chalmers Johnson's course on revolutions, I had written a paper on what we then called guerrilla warfare, wars of national liberation, insurgency, what have you. And from writing that paper, I became convinced we could not win a war in Vietnam, at least at reasonable cost. But for a lot of people a little younger than I was, and who were much less political, that Vietnam was their first really introduction to issues like this. And many of them, although not all, but many, were strongly against the war. And so it really shaped them in a very strongly dovish manner, in a very strong, I don't want to say anti-American, but very critical of American.
So you keep saying, and you keep coming back to the fact that you're very political, but you went the academic route. And there is this kind of unfortunate, I think, divide between the academic community and the policy community, with the academic community oftentimes having very little impact and influence on policy. So when did you decide that you wanted to become an academic? How did that decision happen?
It's interesting, because when I was going through graduate school, I thought I probably wouldn't. I thought I would go either into government or more likely a place like RAND, which was the main think tank. There weren't a lot of think tanks.
And that's the place where academics and research people who really want to have a direct impact on government policy go, right, to a place like RAND.
Also, but the best thing, RAND in the late 50s and early to mid 60s was the best IR department in the country. I mean, it wasn't an IR department in an academic, but the people there, you look at who was there. I mean, Alex George, Bernard Brody, the people who came out for the summers, Tom Schelling, Bill Kaufman, who were interested in national security. The best thinking was being done at RAND. But a couple of things happened that changed that, both changed RAND, changed me. I did have a summer at the Hudson Institute, and I liked some of that. I liked dealing with Herman Kahn and Don Brennan and some of the others, but it was customer driven, and I didn't find that as intellectually satisfying. And then as the 60s went on, RAND lost a lot of its independence. It became more tied to the Defense Department. Not necessarily that it skewed what they were saying, but they weren't doing the same sort of path-breaking intellectual work. And then when I started working dissertation in roughly starting 65, 66, then at Harvard in 67, I got into what later became the logic of images in international relations, about signaling and deception. And that just drew me in deeper and deeper. And that was the first sort of really academic work that had just totally gripped me. And I thought, hey, that's what I really, really like.
So let's talk about that, the logic of images, because that was your first published book, right?
Yes.
Would you just maybe briefly describe for people who haven't read it? I think I read an article about it, but it was in grad school several years ago, so I'm struggling to come up with the main arguments. But would you I'm
glad to advertise it, because please. I still think it's one of my best books, and people don't really understand it. And interestingly enough, it had very important implications from into economics, not as much in political science. The question was initially working on perception. How do we tell whether states are aggressive or not, right? Spiral model versus deterrence. But then led me to the obvious point, well, that's half the side, but also states are trying to project images. Sometimes those images are true, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're images of more powerful, sometimes of being more belligerent than they are. Often it's in the 30s, Hitler making all these efforts to show how peaceful he was. So I said, I should really look at that. How do states project images? And also, Irv Goffman, who was a brilliant sociologist then at Berkeley, where I was a graduate student, had written a book called Presentation of Self in Everyday Life about how individuals project image, what now that's known as impression management. Um, and also, I'd always, from the beginning of when Tom Schelling's book started coming out in 59 or 60,
Is it Arms and Influence you're referring to?
No, the first one, Strategy of Conflict.
Okay.
Arms and Influence, got to tell a story about that in a minute, comes later, but same sort of thing. And I saw those two strands as coming together on how states tried to manipulate the images others had for their own good reasons. Now, sometimes it would be for greater cooperation and peace. This is not necessarily malign. And then that led to the basic question, and as a perceiver, what is the value of various kinds of information you're getting from the other side? Why should I, should I, as a perceiver, pay attention to? And the obvious thing is, well, we pay attention to deeds, not words, but this isn't true. There are a lot of deeds that can be deceptive, and a lot of words are true. And if words had no meaning, people wouldn't talk. You wouldn't have diplomatic conversations if words were meaningless. The fact that there's so much diplomacy indicates it has some value. So instead of words and deeds, I talked about signals and indices. And indices are actions. They can be verbal actions, as well as the deeds and symbolic actions that are believed to be somehow samples of the behavior of concern, or to be inextricably linked to the characteristic that you think will predict the other side.
Could you maybe use a more contemporary example to describe the processes that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, if we see, for instance, the Russian military intervention in Syria, it's not unambiguous, but we can say, well, that is a sort of move that tells me something about Russia, because only, to use contemporary terms, Russia of a certain type would take that behavior. That it may not mean that Russia is going to invade the Baltic republics, but it says something about, say, Russian risk-taking propensities and willingness to pay certain costs. Go back to Vietnam, that it was argued, some validity, that the willingness of America, or at least the American leaders, to pay such a price and to see so many American soldiers killed conveyed a credible message of American willingness to fight for Berlin, because Russia would say the American behavior in Vietnam is an index to the sort of characteristics that it has, an index to the kind of player in the world that it is.
Mm-hmm. Could you say, I mean, that the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq, conveyed that they were willing to do this kind of crazy and reckless thing, to, scare other countries in the region, maybe like Libya, to give up their nuclear weapons, which they did, or to have that kind of neocon fantasy of there's sort of ever-changing regimes throughout the Middle East based on this, fear that they may be next?
I think it had widespread consequences, some good, many bad. I think it did have a significant role, exactly how large, never going to tell, but yes, significant role in convincing Gaddafi to come in from the cold, although he ended up dead, which he didn't expect. But and that is different from what I called signals. Signals are statements or action which gain their meaning through implicit or explicit agreement among the participants. The fact, and that's true for language, the meaning of words is by and large arbitrary, and they carry meaning because we've agreed as to what they mean. And So I played with the distinction between signals and indices as ways in which states projected images in different ways, and then how either could be used for deception and how they were
Um,
judged.
So, how controversial in academic circles at the time was this idea of applying principles of psychology and social
Yeah.
psychology to international relations? Like, how were you received by your colleagues?
Well, this I want to stress before I answer that. The signaling is really almost completely non-psychological.
Mm-hmm.
It is really it was what I call now premature social constructivism, because there wasn't such a thing then. But it really was partly constructivist for saying people are constructing the meaning. And it was premature rational choice because rational choice hadn't entered political science, because I worked out a somewhat rigorous and really fairly deductive approach to this. And it had its influence because I was working with Tom Schelling, and so was Michael Spence, who's a graduate student in economics. And Mike read the manuscript and thought it was very interesting, but for his purposes should be done differently. And he then did his work on labor market screening and costly signaling that led to the enormous work, led to a Nobel Prize for him, alas, not for me, but his Nobel
Not yet.
Prize,
Not yet.
not yet. And all the work mostly in economics on signaling, and that work actually came back into political science, although I think the way it's done political science often is quite simple-minded, and I have an article critiquing it. But that isn't the psychology. But when I did the political psychology, which is indeed the misperception book for which I'm better known, it was marginal, but still had some place, because when it came out, which is in 76, that there was still much more work in psychology. It goes back 1930s and 40s. Political psychology, especially, but not only Freudian psychology, was really a central pillar of political science. That was not true by the 1970, but a lot of the people active still had been either trained in that or at least knew it and didn't think it was odd. And also, there was a strong field of political psychology in American politics, what was called political behavior, really political attitudes. So, it was considered, I think, a little odd, or odd enough to be considered original. Uh, Not quite in the mainstream, but still at least not a total renegade.
Oh, so what was you said there was a story about arms and influence and Thomas Schelling.
Oh, yes, yes, and about the interaction of this and government. I was stunned. I learned this from my good friend, Mark Trachtenberg, who started as a historian, then moved into political science departments. But Mark's work always combined the two. He was doing work in the archives about American defense policy in the mid 60s, 1962, and he found in the early fall of 62 a report from a committee for which Tom was the chair about partly nuclear weapons, even without the Soviet Union, what happened beyond that, and nuclear policy looking ahead 10 years. And that book really is the draft of Arms and Influence.
Huh.
I mean, it's a
Okay.
committee, so it has lots of
A
names.
committee that Schelling was on.
Was chaired, and you
Okay.
read the first three sentences, and it's Tom. I mean, if he has a very distinct writing style, so you can tell this isn't a committee; they've endorsed it, but it's Tom, and it has some things that are not in Arms and Influence, and Arms and Influence has some things that aren't it. But that it is a draft for the government. And it was commissioned by Mac Bundy, who knew, of course, Schelling from Harvard, and Bundy was then Kennedy's national security advisor. And it can be taken very seriously. And they were having a group, including the people on the committee and Bundy and others, to go out to Camp David and spend a weekend or more talking about these things. It turned out that was the time the Cuban Missile Crisis broke, and I don't think they ever had the meeting. But
But I mean, that's a great story about the application of, theory to policy. So fast forward to perception and misperception in international politics, your second book, and the one that you're probably most famous for.
Yeah.
I mean, you said the kernel of that idea came when you were just a child.
Yeah.
But did you, after having written that book and having it out there in the world, see any sort of direct policy implications from having written it, or consequences?
Well, a couple of things. I did. It made me see the world differently. I mean, before I started, I was not really deeply attuned to the cognitive shortcuts people use. I'd, of course, read the work of Simon and a little less relevant, but so partly of Ed Lindblom about, in effect, what we now call heuristics and biases, the term coming out of the later work by Tversky and Kahneman that I also drew on and feel is very valuable. I sort of knew, but it was not deeply embedded. In writing that book, seeing the large number of of times when people went wrong, one thing increases humility, it led me to be much more aware of common misperceptions, and when I hope I'm able to avoid some of those pitfalls myself. And it led me also to see how that was relevant for policy making. And the book was read not by so much policymakers, but read by people who were in or were going into intelligence agencies, especially CIA. And then what happened in the late 70s, or really, I guess, soon after the book was published, Bob Bowie who'd been the director of the Center for International Affairs at Harvard, so been there when I was an assistant professor at Harvard, went in as a deputy director of CIA for intelligence analysis. And so he asked me to become a consultant to CIA because he was familiar with my work, partly on deception, but more on the misperception. And so I was able to then and many years later work with people who are doing intelligence analysis on, hey, how do you not always get it right? We're never going to get it right. Mm-hmm. But how do we build in some checks on common misperceptions?
So if it's declassified by now, if you're allowed to talk about it, like what sort of issues were you working on then in the late 70s in the CIA? Like what were the big, things that they were coming to you with?
Well, there were two things. I did some work on Soviet intentions, which was the big political issue. Detente at this point was falling apart. Soviets also were building up missile forces. This was the time of the so-called CIA Team B report in 1976.
Will you explain that for people who aren't familiar?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. There's a big debate in the late 50s about whether the Soviets thought they could fight and win a nuclear war. CIA by and large said no. Then a lot of the conservatives felt, no, the CIA is much too complacent. And there's political pressure and intellectual pressure, legitimate pressure, to re-examine these estimates. And so under George Bush, as head of the Director of Central Intelligence, they set up, in effect, a red teaming exercise within CIA. It was known as Team B, to do the alternative to the called Team A, which was the regular analysis. And Team B was led by Richard Pipes, a very distinguished historian of Russia and the early years of the Soviet Union. And the study was highly classified, but really the guts of it were not classified. And Pipes published in Commentary an article, Why the Soviet Union Thinks It Can Fight and Win a Nuclear War. A very important article, which I think history and declassified documents on the Soviet side has showed is pretty clearly wrong in most, not all of it, in most of its things. So I was working on that, but then the Iran blew up, and Bob Bowie, who was a head of intelligence, had just testified to Congress that Iran was now pretty stable. So he wanted to know what went wrong.
Hmm.
So he had me do a postmortem on Iran, and that's published in my book, Why Intelligence Fails. And what's interesting is what I found, I believe to have been the pathologies, partly were psychological, but it was also institutional and sociological about the culture of the CIA and the what we now call the intelligence community, excessively focused on current intelligence and summarizing the cables from the field and insufficiently analytical. And then later, again, this was also fully declassified in the book. The other big study I did much later was after the Iraq War. We found Iraq, didn't have active WMD programs. And I volunteered to lead a team to do an analysis of that. The analysis itself, part of what we recommended, is still confidential, but the intellectual arguments on why we were wrong and why the standard arguments for why we were wrong are themselves wrong. That's
Well,
also published in the book.
I mean, will you explain that a little bit? Because this on both cases, let maybe start with Iraq, because I mean this idea that that Saddam Hussein, who did not end up having weapons of mass destruction, would basically like commit regime suicide, is something that's totally an anathema to traditional IR theory, right? So why? So what happened? Yeah.
Well, there are three important lessons from this: for lessons for social science, lessons for the government, I think lessons for everyday life. One is that empathy is terribly hard. We now pretty much know what Saddam was thinking. That's a slight exaggeration, but through various studies, one done by Charlie Delfer for the government, Kevin Woods and his colleagues, based on a lot of the other material.
And basically, he was thinking that he wanted to maintain this perception that he had it in order to deter like Iran or deter Shiites from rising up. So he was willing to let the U.S. invade.
He didn't think we were coming to get him. Yes, he was more worried about Iran and as his first enemy, the Shia, the second enemy. We're probably 4 or 5 on his list. So he doesn't believe we're really going to invade him. And even when we start, he doesn't. He could have blown the dams, flooded the rivers, made our invasion much slower and more difficult. Well, he doesn't do it because we're not coming to Baghdad. So this is crazy. If I were to erase your memory and to give you 2 piles, one is the official intelligence at the time, and the other are these reports that we now have, and ask which is right, just given from what you know about the world, you're going to pick the official intelligence every time. You're going to say these later reports that we think are now right, this is going to make a great movie, but it's a comedy. We don't believe that. Mm-hmm. So I think a couple of big lessons. There's a lot of things out there in the world that are really bizarre. And empathizing with people who are bizarre and who are doing things that will lead to their death, that's very hard. So as my colleague Dick Betts puts it, when you have things that are important exceptions to important social science generalizations, intelligence and common sense are likely to get them wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's partly why we got this wrong. It was perfectly sensible that he would actually have active WMD programs, and totally unsensible that he wouldn't have them, but would leave us in doubt about this.
And it kind of gets back to this idea of bounded rationality, right?
That
the set of assumptions that Saddam is working on are not the same set of assumptions that George Bush or the U.S. policymakers are working on, and therefore that could lead to what you call like misperceptions, and which leads to wars that might not have been necessary.
But it's even worse in this case, because in some times, like before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they had a worldview that we didn't fully understand. But if I explained it, it's then pretty intelligible about why they felt they were painted into a corner. But with Saddam, even when you explain it, you've got to say, really? How could he have believed that? How could he think that he was deterring Iran by pretending to have programs that weren't going to yield anything for another 5 or 10 years. That doesn't deter. So, I mean, even when I understand what I think are his assumptions, I'm really deeply puzzled by them. So it's very hard for intelligence or
Maybe there's like insanity in international relations is
yeah,
like have sort of abnormal social and psychological behavior as the next study of IR theory.
yeah, and I don't mean that Bush is like Saddam, but the terrible deficit in post-war planning in Iraq. No one could believe that because I mean, great powers don't behave that irresponsibly. Well, he did. But who would have believed that? There are a lot of things that go on in the world that, you know, just defy common sense and our theories, and that's deeply troublesome.
Do you think that policymakers in the United States are getting any better at understanding misperception in international relations? Like,
Yeah,
is this what you describe? I don't see as a principal lesson being
yeah,
drawn from the Iraq fiasco.
yeah,
But how do you see both maybe the intelligence community, which probably you're a little closer to,
yes.
and the policy making community more broadly, drawing from these lessons about misperception?
Well, it may be, of course, a conceit of academics that academics do it better, but I think the IC has gotten better.
IC being the intelligence community.
But yeah, the intelligence, but partly I'm not the only one who's worked with them. And, those people are more amenable to, I think, seeing mistakes and to being much more self conscious about the links between evidence and inference, because a lot of what they did and a lot of the reasons for their overconfidence on Iraq, they made what I call methodological errors, and they now place much more stress on methodology. Uh, Not the key to everything, but I think it makes them. I think there are real improvements there. I think it's true in the mid-level policymaking community, the deputy assistant secretaries, the NSC country directors, most of whom have an MA, if not a PhD, in the social science. The higher levels, I'm not sure. It's really hard. They're taught the pressures on them for time are so great they can hardly be thoughtful. Uh, are they? I like to think that though they're getting better staff support and more sophisticated, but I wouldn't be sure of that. Go back historically, read the memo written by in fact, the top British diplomat in the early part of the 20th century, Sir Eyre Crowe. It's a memo on German intentions written in January 1907 that says Germany is really aggressive. Now, we can debate whether he was right or wrong, but it is an enormously sophisticated essay about the world and implicitly the methodology he uses. The way he establishes his propositions and links them to evidence is enormously sophisticated. So I don't want to say we're necessarily there's complete unilinear progress, but I do think the run-of-the-mill analysis, at least related to an understanding of potential adversaries, is a bit better.
So we're just about out of time, but before I let you go, I did want to ask what you're working on now. Anything we should look out for in the future,
Yeah,
in the near future?
I'm I'm thinking a lot about Iran, about Syria, and have worked on some negotiations with Iran on the basic question of how you deal with troublesome actors and avoiding spirals. What I'm writing now is a new introduction to perception and misperception. I'm not going to rewrite the book. It would just take more years than I have left. But I'm doing, there'll be a very, very long forward that will talk about where my thinking has progressed in what will be the 40 years since I
So,
wrote the book and where the new psychology is going.
Can you give us a tease of how
Yeah.
you might approach, say, ISIS in this
Oh,
formulation?
ISIS. Oh, I'd rather not approach ISIS. Very hard to understand. Uh, I would say a little related to ISIS, but the thing I'm stressing in the foreword is that, and linked to what we've been talking about, the role of emotions in politics and indeed general life is much greater than I gave in perception, which was, if you will, purely cognitive. That emotions are very powerful and they color the way we look at the world and the way we design policies. I'm not saying that people are emotional in a bad sense, but the emotional and the cognitive are so interwoven that we just have to understand that and deal with it better.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time, for speaking with me, and for increasing my own and I think a lot of my listeners' understanding of how the world works.
Glad to do it.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening to this conversation with Robert Jervis, who died on December 9th, 2021, at the age of 81. His work was deeply impactful to me, how I understand the world. I know it has been deeply impactful to many people who listen to this show. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation and take some comfort in it. If you want to access more of these kinds of long-form interviews with scholars and journalists and diplomats and others who have led interesting careers in foreign policy and world affairs, you can become a premium subscriber by going to patreon.com/globaldispatches. And there are about a couple hundred of these interviews that I have in the archive. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.